Continuing debate, the reprise du débat, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's such an honour to rise and speak to Bill C-8 on behalf of the good people of Northwest BC. This evening I'd like to talk about people in small communities, and at the end, if I have time, I want to touch on an issue facing some of Canada's largest municipalities. But at heart, I'm a small-town boy, so I'll start with the rural communities in the riding I represent. The largest community in Skeena-Bulkley Valley is only about 12 or 13,000 people. The rest of the residents live in very small communities and villages and rural areas, and it's their concerns and their needs that I would like to begin with tonight, because this legislation includes changes that affect them in many ways. The ones I want to focus in on are the proposed changes to the Northern Residents Tax Deduction, a part of the Income Tax Act that is intended to account for the higher costs of living in Canada's northern and rural communities, remote communities, the farthest flung places in our country. And for a long time, this system in the Income Tax Act had a very complex formula for determining remoteness of these places in the north. And in the 1990s, that formula changed, and essentially the federal government drew an arbitrary line across the map of our country. If you're above the line, then you get the Northern Residents Deduction. If you're below the line, you don't get it. Now, this affects a lot of people in the place that I get to represent. And in the bill before us, the government has seen fit to make changes to the travel portion of that Northern Residents Deduction. That's certainly a welcome change, making it more flexible in the eligibility criteria so that residents within one of those northern zones are able to claim more of the expenses they pay out for travel. But it doesn't get to this underlying problem with the fairness of that arbitrary line on the map. Now, this is an issue that has been raised by my constituents for a long time, going back well over a decade. My predecessor, Nathan Cullen, who sat in this House, brought this up and tabled a private member's bill on behalf of the good residents of Haida, Gwaii, and I was honored in the last Parliament to table a similar bill, because Haida, Gwaii, one of the most remote places in our country, this is an archipelago that is separated from the mainland by a 7-hour ferry ride. Now, Haida, Gwaii used to qualify for the full Northern Residents Deduction, but in 1993, it was moved to the intermediate zone. So residents there now only receive 50% of the deduction. When I travel to Haida, Gwaii, and I hope to be back really soon, this is something that so many residents bring to my attention. Now, on Haida, Gwaii, the cost of living is high for a number of reasons, mostly because all of the goods that you purchase have to be brought in by ferry. And for so many reasons, residents have to travel to the mainland for services and other reasons. I talked to Evan Putterall. He's a local government elected representative on Haida, Gwaii. He talked about auto repairs, that only certain auto repairs are available on island, and you have to go off island for so many others. I've had residents raise the issue of shipping rates. That's another huge issue, postal shipping to remote parts of the riding, and so many other things. The cost of groceries, the cost of fuel, the cost of building supplies, these are all more expensive in remote places in Northwest BC. So the hope is that we can change that arbitrary criteria, and this would help places like Haida, Gwaii, but other places as well, because Haida, Gwaii, although Haida, Gwaii is in that intermediate zone and does qualify for half of the tax deduction, there are other communities in Northwest BC that don't qualify at all, and for which the changes that this government has proposed in Bill C-8 are irrelevant because they do not fit into one of those prescribed zones. Sarah Story, the mayor of Fraser Lake, brought this to the attention of the North Central Local Government Association. They proposed something called a rural living allowance. They have ideas for how we can fix this, but we need to go beyond an arbitrary line on the map. I also met with Linda McGuire, the mayor of Granisle, and her council. They talked about the fact that to access services and goods, many of their residents have to drive to the District of Houston, which is 80 kilometers. They want to attract more residents to their community, and the cost of living and the cost of goods is a major barrier. I spoke about this in the House earlier today, and then later posted about it on social media. And Brian Landy from Bella Coola brought to my attention his beautiful community. And I was thinking about the last time that I went to Bella Coola. For folks who haven't been, Bella Coola and the Bella Coola Valley on Newhawk territory is a spectacular place. When you drive there by car, the nearest major center is Williams Lake. And I only say major center in the sense of rural places, because it itself isn't a huge municipality. But it's 450-kilometer drive from Williams Lake to Bella Coola. And you cross the Chilcotin Plateau, and then you go down a gravel road, this incredibly steep hill that drops 5,000 feet down into the Bella Coola Valley. It is one of the most remote places in British Columbia, and yet it doesn't qualify for the Northern Residence Deduction under the Income Tax Act. The residents of Bella Coola pay exorbitant costs for all sorts of things. The one they've brought to my attention most recently is parcel shipping. Because their postal code has been designated by Canada Post as a remote postal code, companies that do mail orders charge exorbitant costs to get a parcel to Bella Coola. So these are the kinds of costs that an improved Northern Living Allowance in the Income Tax Act could help to offset. It would help small communities like Bella Coola and Granisle and Fraser Lake attract residents, develop their economies, and it would help people there live more affordable lives. Hear, hear. Now, I was very pleased to table a petition in the last Parliament on this topic. Hundreds of residents from Northwest BC signed a petition urging the government to bring Haida Gwaii into the northern zone for the Northern Residence Deduction. Yeah. And I also tabled a motion, M22, which I was pleased to retable in this Parliament. And that motion calls on the government to strike a task force and look at the eligibility criteria in the Income Tax Act for the Northern Residence Deduction. We need a better way of defining what a remote community is, because not all of the remote communities in Canada are in the far north. There are many communities that are separated by long roads that are only seasonally accessible, that face really high costs of living. Those communities need to be served by this provision in our Income Tax Act. And despite a decade of members of Parliament calling on the government to make those changes, we've heard nothing. So it's something that needs to change, Mr. Speaker. And rural and remote residents across our country would be better for it. Rural places are an important part of the fabric of this country, and we can recognize that by changing the Income Tax Act. Hear, hear. Now, I want to shift, and I see I only have 2 minutes left. I want to shift to an issue facing some of Canada's largest municipalities, and you'll have to excuse the whiplash while I move to the issue of public transit. And on January 26th, just last week, the mayors of Canada's biggest cities called on this government. They said they were pushing the emergency button on public transit funding. Public transit is in crisis right now. The pandemic has cut revenue for transit systems by as much as 80%. Even 2 years into the pandemic, transit systems are only at 40 to 50% of their original ridership. The only way municipalities can make their budgets balance, and they're not allowed to run deficits, is to cut services and cut routes. What we risk here is a downward spiral. We're building new transit systems, we're building new infrastructure, that's wonderful, but we need to ensure that the essential workers, that seniors, that students, that people who rely on public transit during the pandemic have that service available to them. If we cut transit service in Canada's cities, we're going to see people move to other modes of transportation, and it's going to be very difficult to get them back on public transit. We need more people riding public transit, not fewer. It's important for so many reasons, for equity reasons, for climate reasons, and it's part of the future that we need to build together. The big city mayors have spoken. We haven't heard from this government. We don't see in the fall economic statement any money for transit operating costs. We need to see it. There's still a chance. I hope that this government will hear the call of the FCM and the big city mayors and make that funding a part of Canada's future. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Now, we only have about 4 minutes for questions and answers before 6:30 rolls around, so some quick questions and answers. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, this is a federal government that has invested in public transit, which is somewhat new. And the question I have for the member is if he could provide some clarity. Within the legislation, we're saying that there's going to be a 1% annual tax for non-residents, non-Canadians, for unoccupied dwellings. That's in its simplest form. Does the member support that? And is there any other initiative that he would like to encourage on that specific front?
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Parliamentary Secretary for the question. There were two pieces in there. The first one around transit funding, and there was funding for transit operations as part of the Safe Restart Agreement. I know that was welcomed by municipalities, but it ran out a long time ago. What they're asking is continued support on the operating side until we get through the pandemic and transit ridership rebounds. It's absolutely vital that we get that in place. And yes, the 1% tax is a very small step. We need much more on housing, including a dedicated plan on Indigenous housing. And I'll leave it at that, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de Beauport-Limoilou.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I heard my colleague talk about the problems with the Postal Service, and it brought back memories of a time when I lived in the Côte-Nord region. There is a service called Solutions for Small Businesses, and I wondered if there is a way to improve that the Canada Post solution. So I wanted to ask him what happens in his riding for transporting food, medication, and so on.
Thank you for the question to my colleague through you, Mr. Speaker. The situation facing small businesses and shipping goods is a huge issue, especially through the postal system. And I think it's wrong that big companies like Amazon get preferential rates when they use our national postal system compared to small businesses that want to do mail orders and they want to ship a smaller volume of packages, and they have to pay exorbitant rates to do so. I think that's fundamentally wrong. The issue residents face is a little bit different. I'd be happy to talk to my colleague about it afterwards.
Time for one more. Questions and answers, questions and comments. Go online. The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the last election, I have to say that the most common global concern I heard was one of the climate crisis, and my honourable colleague touched on public transit. I'm just wondering if you can expand a bit on how a massive expansion of public transit in Canada may help us address climate crisis, and particularly how that might reveal itself in terms of smaller communities like the ones he represents and between cities, what that would look like.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley in about 35 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for the question. Absolutely, when it comes to the climate crisis and driving down Canada's greenhouse gases, public transit is such an important solution, not just for big cities, but for rural places as well. When we look at the transport sector as a whole, it's one of Canada's fastest growing sources of emissions. And we know that when we get people on public transit, we have less congestion, we have better developed communities, and we have people who are more socially connected as well. So there's so many reasons to get people riding public transit. We can't do that unless this government helps municipalities with the kind of funding that they've asked for.